what you've got is you've got this race. And that is, by the time that the economy really goes south, let's say it takes a few months, has Trump embedded his authoritarian rule in so deep that it becomes difficult to challenge him, even if people are getting really, really pissed off? Does he have military on America's streets? Has he completely butchered American agencies and taken control of them? In other words, most strongmen in the long run do need to be economically successful. Hitler needed to do it in Germany before he made the mistake of World War II. Mussolini needed to do it in Italy. You could talk about it in more recent times. Trump is economically illiterate. Let's repeat that. He's an economic moron.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I'm delighted to say that I am joined by a friend of the show, Scott Lucas, a professor of international and American studies at the Clinton Institute at the University of College Dublin. Scott, thank you so much for joining us today.
Maddie, thank you so much for having me here.
Well, you and I we're gonna actually get mostly into a lot of domestic US news, which we haven't had the pleasure of doing in a while because, of course, there's been so much going on in the international space and the US's involvement. So I want to start off with Donald Trump. In the last few days, he's been mentioning the word dictator a little bit in regards to this crime emergency going on in Washington, D.C., where he appointed National Guard troops to work with Metropolitan Police in quite a bizarre and unusual situation. Trump also said that he wants to pursue the death penalty in D.C. for murder crimes across the city. So here's what Trump said after originally saying perhaps the US would like a dictator. He said, they say we don't need him. Freedom, freedom. He's a dictator. He's a dictator. A lot of people are saying maybe we like a dictator. I don't like a dictator. I'm not a dictator. I'm a man with great common sense and a smart person. So, Scott, look, your reaction to these comments about being a dictator, whether or not he is one, in conjunction with what's happening right now in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I think that's the way to approach it, Maddie, because, Trump is always the performance artist. So, do you take him literally, seriously, both, right? And that, that's becoming especially important, given the fact that I would say at the least that he's a wannabe authoritarian. So let's break it down. He pops up on Monday of this week, does an appearance before the press, handles a range of questions, and then he comes out with a quote very similar to what you just read out there, which is, well, some people would really like a dictator, and then, but me, of course, not me, but look, I'm doing great dictating, right? And then yesterday at the 3-hour-long kiss the backside of the emperor cabinet meeting, which was excruciatingly painful and would have made even Kim Jong-un blush, he gives another statement as everyone's talking about how great he is, which is on this, what you just read out. And it's like, okay, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, to pull the curtain back once is unfortunate. To pull it back twice appears to be something a little bit more sinister. That brings you to the reality. And I'm going to state something because we love all the Trumpists who come in to give us comments afterwards. So we're just going to put it directly to them. There was no need to put the U.S. military onto the streets of D.C. None. Zero. I could go through the statistics for you. I could talk to you about how homicides were down this year by 30%, that they had peaked in 2023, but they are down by well over 60% since then. Carjackings were down significantly. Violent crime overall down 26%. The DC authorities were trying to deal with this. But Trump comes tearing in, and I want to, Maddie, do you remember the pretext they used to put the military onto the streets of DC?
No, I'm trying to think about what they said. Wasn't there also something to do with the amount of homelessness going on?
They talk about Trump got upset that he saw homeless people, as he supposedly, because he's such a hard-working guy.
Which can we also just say that is not a DC problem? Trump, that actually is an America problem.
Yeah, exactly. And we could walk into years why that there are issues in America to be dealt with, such as drug use, such as a lack of effective care for people who are drug dependent, such as a lack of housing. But the fact is, Trump said, oh, I'll go in there and I see homeless people. And I don't want to see homeless people. Why would I want to do that? I'm the emperor. Get them out of here. But it was specifically a guy named Edward Korestein, who is still either 19, 20 years old now. You may not remember Edward Korestein. He's one of Elon Musk's boys, who was part of the so-called Department of Government Efficiency that went in to rip up U.S. agencies. He's the guy who bragged that his name that everyone should call him is Big Balls. Well, Big Balls got into a confrontation and said he had been carjacked. And that was the entire pretext for why they sent in the National Guard. And then let us emphasize that when they sent the National Guard in a few weeks ago, they said, well, they're going to go in, but they're not going to have guns. They're there just to support local law enforcement. They're there just to support them. About a week ago, they came out and said, oh, they're going to be carrying guns now. They're armed. And Maddie, when they did that, we'll get back to Trump and dictatorship in a minute. When they did that, but I just want to put this out, I can tell you what I immediately thought of. I was an associate for a time of the American University of Beirut. So I would go out to Lebanon, which has a very troubled history, as viewers probably know. And I've been living in the UK for quite some time. So when I got to Beirut, the first thing that strikes me when I get in there, this started off in 2005, and then I went there for several years after that, is the military on the streets, armed military on the streets. And it just made me recoil, because and when this happened in the States, I'm thinking, what's it going to be like seeing American military forces on the streets, right? And given the fact also, and here's a quick reminder, that National Guard are supposed to be under the control of local and state officials, specifically governors. Now, Trump can get away with it in D.C. because D.C. is a federal area. It's a special case. But he is, of course, now talking about rolling this out into other cities, probably beginning with Chicago. Why does this give us into the big picture? Donald Trump wants to have the military serve him. Okay? Now, at this point, it is to support trying to sweep up immigrants, to detain and disappear them. It is to just simply look tough. But once you have the military on the streets and once you arm them, it can escalate. It can escalate unintentionally.
And it's very third world, isn't it, Scott? And also not to mention how that would deter tourists. And of course, you can't deny that there is crime, a lot of crime in American cities. It's undeniable. And the thought of Donald Trump wanting to clean that up is a great thing. I commend it. I've been to the US, I've been to cities where I genuinely haven't felt very safe. And so I'm all on board. But yes, the problem being is, when do you deploy the National Guard to work in conjunction with the Metropolitan Police? It's very rare cases that you would do that.
Yeah, and again, we're going to walk through a couple of things reality-wise. First thing is, it does not make the city feel safer when you put the military out there. And in fact, Trump, one of his most blatant lies has been, everybody's coming back to the restaurants. They're all loving it. Whoa, everybody, look, and moms and dads and their families. It's wonderful. In fact, restaurants have suffered a significant drop in bookings and in people showing up since this started. People are not going to restaurants. They're not going out because they got this atmosphere on the streets, which is one of tension because of the military walking around. And when you have tension like that, does it make it more or less likely that something's going to kick off? Well, I'll let you fill that sentence. And in terms of your big point, which is, yes, crime is fact of the matter is, we could talk about realistic ways to deal with crime. We could start, by talking about gun control.
I'm not opening that can of worms.
Well, exactly. And the Trump administration definitely isn't going to do anything to talk about gun control. We could talk about the fact that certain cities, in terms of their urban areas, that certain parts of them have been developed and certain parts of them haven't been developed. San Francisco is a case in point, which has had significant problems that we talk about. But the ultimate thing that we talk about is that the American political culture until now has been that it's up to states and local communities with federal support to try to deal with that across the board, including with things such as community policing. What you do not do is turn this into a quasi-military situation. And what you do not do is then portray that the ultimate goal for this is this guy's authority, the dictator who says he's not a dictator.
Absolutely. Scott, let's move on to a separate issue. What's happening? The Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, she has officially been fired by Donald Trump over allegations that she committed mortgage fraud. Lisa Cook says she refuses to stand down, that it's not in his power to be firing her. She's done nothing wrong. Her lawyer, Abby Lowell, who's Hunter Biden's lawyer as well, if his name rings a bell to any of our listeners and viewers, said that she would sue to challenge the dismissal. So this could erupt into a lawsuit. So it's the last thing that she would want. And now, this is confusing what's transcribed here, but what's transpired here, I should say, sorry. Politics behind this, it doesn't really matter to the average person. No one is looking up this situation thinking, oh, I really want to read more about that. That's going to affect my life, blah, blah, blah. But this could affect the average American if it disrupts the US economy. So, Scott, is there a chance that it could do that?
Well, it will do it. First of all, before getting into the economics, let's just take it. If you don't want to call it dictatorship, let's call it authoritarianism, part 2. Wannabe authoritarianism. The Federal Reserve is an independent body. It was set up as an independent body, similar to the reason why the Bank of England is an independent body. Because to carry out economic policy, especially your monetary policy, to do it in a stable way to deal with inflation, to deal with questions such as economic growth, you need to do that in terms of the basis on sound economic judgments. You don't do it for short-term political gains. And that's why the system is set up the way it is in the UK now. And it's why the Federal Reserve has been set up. And this is part of a wider history. I could take you back to the 19th century about the independence of financial institutions so they could not be politically rigged. Donald Trump does not want any independent institutions, political, economic, otherwise, in the U.S. government. He wants to control everything. So there is an element of the authoritarian here. What does it mean economically? The Federal Reserve, similar to the Bank of England, will meet every few months and they'll decide what you need to do with interest rates. And of course, you have to weigh up what you do with interest rates in terms of trying to control inflation, but at the same time, trying to stimulate growth in the economy, especially if you've had a slowdown. Now, going into 2025, what the Federal Reserve, led by a man named Jerome Powell, it has 7 governors, was going to do is they were going to go onto a phased reduction of interest rates. The reason why they were doing that is that the United States had come out of the post-pandemic recession. The Biden administration, and we can disagree or agree with it on a number of policies, but it had been relatively successful working with the Fed to come up with what we call a soft landing. The U.S. economy is growing again. You don't want to decrease interest rates too far because you don't want to spike inflation, but you do want to bring them down gradually, right? What upset that? What upset that was Donald Trump. Because when Trump came into office, what he did was 2 things. One is he vastly increased the federal government's deficit. So the federal government needs to get more money, needs to borrow more money for that deficit. If you lower interest rates, it makes it more difficult to get that money. And 2, he went on to his tariff chaos, his tariff spree. Now, when you introduce tariffs, it not only destabilizes the economy, it feeds inflation. So the Federal Reserve's plan was completely thrown out of whack. And that is what Jerome Powell would come and he would explain it very logically to people. And every time Jerome Powell would explain it over the past few months, Donald Trump would go on to Truth Social, and in all caps, he would say that Jerome Powell was a nincompoop, that Jerome Powell was an idiot, that Jerome Powell doesn't know what he's talking about. And he'd sit there and insult Jerome Powell. And it got to a point where a few weeks ago, the Trump people set up this ruse to try to force Powell out. And that is the Federal Reserve's getting a new building built. And as with many buildings, you have cost overruns. Well, they decided they would blame Jerome Powell for this. And Trump set up a photo op with Jerome Powell as he's showing them around the Federal Reserve, and he ambushed him. He said, oh, look at all these overruns. Look at all these overruns. Look at the cost of this. Look at the cost of this. And Powell, at one point, said, well, let me have a look at that. He says, look, that's a building which has already been built that you're talking about. That's not a cost overrun. What are you doing? And Trump said, and huffed off. Well, when they couldn't fire Powell, or decided not to fire Powell, what they tried to do is that they're trying to pack the Fed where a majority of the Federal Reserve governors are sympathetic to Trump, will bow down to Trump. Now, there's one vacancy on the Fed that they're already going to be able to fill. So they might, in other words, get 3 people sympathetic to Trump, but they need a 4th to get a majority. How do they get the 4th? They go after this woman named Lisa Cook, the first black woman.
Appointed by Biden.
Yeah, appointed by Biden. Federal Reserve governors have 14-year terms. See, that's long stint, or sorry, maybe 16 years even. It's either 14 or 16.
She's up in 2038.
Yeah, so I think it's 16 actually. So she's there till 2038. Well, how do you get her out? They use the same ruse that they've used with other political enemies, including Senator Adam Schiff of California, which is they look at applications for mortgages for second homes. Now, it is technically, you're not allowed to apply for a mortgage on your second home and declare it your primary home. That's not allowed in the States. And they've said that Schiff did this. They've said without evidence that Lisa Cook did this. And there is no evidence of this. But one of the Trump lackeys, who's the head of the Federal Housing Administration, comes out and says this. And now they're trying to whip up the firestorm where she will resign. Trump can't fire her. He legally cannot fire her. So they want to try to get her to resign, but she's fighting it. So this is going to go all the way through the courts. Meanwhile, economically, what does it do? Your Fed's in disarray. Your Fed is politically in disarray. So even if they met in September and decided to lower interest rates, people will look at it and say, well, the only reason they lowered interest rates is because of Trump's political pressure. Economic markets, manufacturers, investors need stability. They need a stable, predictable system that runs according to the rules of the game. When you rip up the rules because you're serving the authoritarian or the dictator, that's gone.
So Scott, in other words, Trump's authoritarian desires will bite him in the butt in the one area that he's meant to be succeeding in, which is the US economy.
Yeah, but how long will it take before it bites? Because the thing about the US economy is...
Well, that in conjunction, Scott, that in conjunction with the tariffs.
Well, yeah, sorry, the economy of tariffs are going to cause all kinds of instabilities. They already are. I mean, it's caught, U.S. inflation is starting to tick upwards. Supply chains are beginning to get compromised. Certain manufacturers reporting heavy losses, such as General Motors last quarter, I think $1.2 billion. But for most Americans, it would be like, well, we had like 2.5% inflation under Biden at the end of last year. Now it's 3%, right? It hasn't gone up a huge amount yet because people had stockpiled, anticipating the tariffs. And so what you've got is you've got this race. And that is, by the time that the economy really goes south, let's say it takes a few months, has Trump embedded his authoritarian rule in so deep that it becomes difficult to challenge him, even if people are getting really, really pissed off? Does he have military on America's streets? Has he completely butchered American agencies and taken control of them? In other words, most strongmen in the long run do need to be economically successful. Hitler needed to do it in Germany before he made the mistake of World War II. Mussolini needed to do it in Italy. You could talk about it in more recent times. Trump is economically illiterate. Let's repeat that. He's an economic moron. So in the long term, he will not be economically successful. But in the short term, he still may be able to ride out the damage by strong-arming everybody and relying upon that mythical base by saying, the economy's not your enemy. The economy's not your foe. Immigrants are your foe. Ethnic minorities are your foe. The woke left are your foe. You need to turn against them so that their anger is not about the fact, so that their anger is directed elsewhere.
It's a tactic that he's used quite often, and it has been successful, but it was interesting to watch that tactic being used when it came to the Epstein drama because it wasn't working, and it was just interesting to watch his own base say, no, we're not playing that game. But I want to move on because we don't have very long. Now, this situation happening in Denmark is quite humorous, to say the very least. Now, for anyone who's not across this, Denmark's foreign minister has summoned the top US diplomat over to Copenhagen, who's not based in Copenhagen, over allegations that American citizens have been conducting a covert influence operation in Greenland. Now, sources are claiming that the aim of these unknown and unnamed Americans was to influence Greenlanders to like the idea of basically Greenland no longer belonging to Denmark as an autonomous country, but to the US, which is, of course, what Donald Trump wants. We've seen the polls since this idea was brought to life in maybe January, I think, where 85% of Greenlanders were opposed to this idea. Now, Scott, the Trump administration haven't responded to this report. We don't know who these people are. We don't know the extent of this operation. But do you think this looks like the work of Trump, or is it just MAGA enthusiasts, I guess, working on their own accord?
No, it's a Trump camp. I mean, it's a Trump camp. So what we know so far, first of all, is that the Danish government under Mette Frederiksen has come out and said, yes, that, we summoned U.S. Representatives of the U.S. Embassy to complain about these three people. They did not go into detail about what the covert operations were, but there's one clue in that they have also restated today, made a statement today, their regret over what was a forced contraception campaign between, I think, 1960 and the early 1990s to limit the growth of the Inuit population in Greenland, which has been a source of discord, as it should be, amongst the population. So it appears that the three Americans who were wandering around up there were using that issue to try to rile folks up. Now, this gets a bit complex because this isn't an all or nothing. In other words, it's not that Greenland remains part of Denmark or Greenland comes and joins the U.S. as the 51st state. There's also the possibility that Greenland could become independent, but then U.S. economic interest who really want the rare earth minerals that are up there in Greenland, that they come in and try to buy up Greenland, an independent Greenland. What we saw earlier this year, just to remind people, is that Trump was thundering that Greenland should become part of the United States, blah, 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 blah. And the serious campaign is when they sent people into Greenland to rile up the local population. And they did it publicly on that case because it was Charlie Kirk, a really hard right polemicist who has become normalized in the States, including on UK television, and Donald Trump Jr. But they were so inept in what they were doing as they wore their MAGA hats and paid homeless people to go into restaurants and wear MAGA hats, right? Because they got a free meal, that it turned people in Greenland against them. So the pro-independence movement in Greenland said, we don't want anything to do with this. But what's happened here is you can see that the Trumpists haven't given up, that they're sending people back in there. It's classic Trumpist behavior, which is to link up with local folks to try to turn them against the ruling government. It's happening in the UK right now. Have a look at who J.D. Vance met with a few weeks ago. I'll say no more about that at this point. But in this case, I think the Danish government is probably on safe ground here, which is that most people in Greenland, even if they want independence, do not want it to be at the dictates of the Americans. So I think this will cause just a bit of embarrassment for the wannabe authoritarian back in Washington, if he happens to notice this amongst his other tasks today.
Well, you're right. A vast majority of Greenlanders, their population, do actually want independence from Denmark. They just want to be a sovereign, independent state, but they very much don't want to be a part of the United States. So, I mean, we saw Trump's comments really quieten down when it came to his desires to annex Greenland, especially because the Danish Prime Minister was so awkward about it. But you know what? This could have just been his, roundabout way of trying to continue this desire without having to get publicly scrutinized over it. But Scott, we're going to move on because an interesting thing has happened also in the last day. A whistleblower has come forward and alleged that the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, of course, once run by Elon Musk, uploaded a copy of the Social Security Administration's database to a vulnerable cloud server. Now, this whistleblower is Social Service Security Administration Chief Data Officer Charles Borges. He said that the private data of every American who has a social security number or who has ever applied for one is at risk at the hands of DOGE. Now, Scott, this is a pretty big bombshell claim to make from this whistleblower, a named whistleblower. So run me through this.
So this official from the Social Security Administration has now made this official. So this is an official complaint, but it's something that we actually suspected at the time. When Elon Musk boys, including the person we referred to in the start of this discussion, Big Balls, went running into all these agencies. They'd run into these agencies, and this included Department of Energy, it included the U.S. Agency for International Development, it included the Treasury, it included the Department of Labor. They even tried to do this in the Pentagon and the CIA, and they went and said, look, we want all your records. Give us all your records, give us all your documents. Now, they had no legal authority to get those documents, none, because the Department of Government Efficiency is not a department. It was not instituted, established by Congress. It was a group of guys who were working for Donald Trump and for Elon Musk. All right, when they get this information, what exactly do they want to do with it? Now, the public explanation is, we want to try to cut waste. We want to cut waste. Here's a quick newsflash. Doge may have cost more money than it saved now. At best, we're talking maybe about in the tens of billions of dollars that it may have saved, supposedly cut. But the amount of money that it took to run Doge may have outstripped that. So it didn't save money. And indeed, newsflash, in part because of Trump's big, not so beautiful bill, there are trillions of dollars which have been added to the federal government's debt this year. Instead, what they wanted to do is they wanted to get control of information. But for whom, right? Did they want to control this information to be used by Trump, by other officials around Trump? Or did they want it to be able to be used by various corporations, various groups? In other words, it's pretty serious to lift information from the Social Security Administration, which is the personal data of Americans. But when you put it into a vulnerable cloud, what you're talking about is we're putting it into a space where it can be exploited by anyone who knows how to get to that information. Unanswered question, Maddie, who got to that information and for what purposes? If this had happened in terms of, like, let's say a UK company with all its customers, that all their information was available, this would dominate headlines in the UK for days and has done in the past. This is what has happened now, according to this whistleblower, is that the US government, or rather Elon Musk people infiltrating the US government, have effectively committed one of the most serious data breaches that we've had in recent memory. We'll see where the complaint goes, but it matches up with what we were seeing months ago. And the question is, beyond this, were there other data breaches that we just don't know about yet that will be confirmed by other officials as they begin to blow the whistle?
Well, yes, and we're going to stay on this just to wrap up the interview. Now, this would be millions and millions of Americans whose social security number would have been exposed. It's not just the social security number as well, Scott. It's addresses, emails, so much private stuff that you wouldn't want to be leaked to the public. And you don't even know who is at risk, what is at risk. But in conjunction to that, in March, the White House released the JFK files, right? 80,000 pages of documents, photographs, audio and videos related to the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963. Now, the eagerness for the White House to release it so quickly meant that sloppiness followed. And what that meant was around over 200 individuals had their social security numbers made public, which included former congressional staffers. This, as well as the Signalgate drama, and now, if this whistleblower is correct in the fact that Doge put this onto a cloud server, does the Trump administration have a problem with national security?
They don't care. This is the point here. I mean, they don't care. I mean, Signalgate was Pop Gun Pete Hegseth, right? And Mike Waltz, who's now hidden at the UN, simply going, we don't care about the normal procedures for maintaining security. We're just going to set up a WhatsApp group and we'll just chat about it here. And then Pop Gun Pete setting up, remember, a second WhatsApp group with his family and friends where he's going, look at what I'm getting to do. Look at me. I'm the defense secretary. Here, I'll drink to that. And you're like, cheers, mate. In the case of the Social Security leaks and the other leaks, an authoritarian doesn't care about you. And I'm going to emphasize this to all, and some of my family members and my friends, they like that Donald Trump. And I'm going to repeat to them, so he doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about your welfare. He doesn't care about your day-to-day life. He only cares that you worship him. So he doesn't care if your security is compromised. Elon Musk doesn't care if your security is compromised. Elon Musk would like to have all your details because he can use that in some of his ventures. Some other people, I'll leave them unnamed for legal reasons, but who are connected with Elon Musk, who could exploit this information, they don't care about you. Information is power, and your personal information is power when it's in someone else's hands. And when you destroy, what is ultimately happening in the U.S. government is this. You are destroying the checks and the balances on excessive authority. They have defied the courts to do this. They have tried to overrun Congress to do this. They're trying to rig the state electoral systems to do this. Talk about that next time. And they are trying to do this by making it impossible for agencies to operate independently. And until the media, activists, other groups push back and say this is unacceptable, because I'm really ticked off with some of the U.S. media right now who supposedly are the mainstream, because they are just so passive in the face of this. Until they get their act together, Trump, Musk, others will take this as far as they can, because the one thing about an authoritarian is they don't recognize rules. The rules are to be broken.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you, Maddie.